The summit reveals the huge but brittle egos of these two monarchs, Henry VIII of England and Francis I of France. At one point, Henry challenges Francis to a wrestling match, and he loses. So this is really a humbling personal moment, and you can imagine this didn't do much to improve the chances of amity and peace, because Henry did not like to be humiliated.
Welcome to the Creating History podcast. I'm Russell Barnes, a documentary filmmaker and producer of history programs and now podcasts.
And I'm David Reynolds, Emeritus Professor of International History at Cambridge University.
David, I've always wondered, what does emeritus mean?
Oh, well, if I'm asked that question, I like to go to a story that's told about Rupert Murdoch, the newspaper tycoon. It may be true, it may not, but it seems to me it's so good, it ought to be true. So the story goes that when Rupert Murdoch sacked Frank Giles as the editor of the London Sunday Times, Giles was understandably, a bit fed up. And so Murdoch said, "Don't worry, Frank, don't worry. You'll be editor emeritus." So Giles says, "What the expletive deleted does that mean?" "Don't you know your Latin, Frank? E means you're out. And meritus, Frank, meritus means you deserve it." So I'm very happy in my position as Professor Emeritus. It means I don't have to do any work any longer for the history department at Cambridge, because there's a statutory retirement age. But because Cambridge is a collegiate university, different colleges have different rules and regulations. And my own college is happy for me still to do some teaching of current students. And it's rather fun now to be teaching people who were born in the 21st century, who don't have a memory even of 9/11, for example. I'm teaching them and talking to them and discussing with them the 20th century.
Ancient history to them.
Yes, prehistoric.
David, in our last series, Creating Churchill, we explored Winston Churchill's life, including his gift for inventing resonant phrases that shaped world politics. And rather fittingly, it was Churchill who coined the term that's the subject of our new series, Summits, to describe high-level meetings between world leaders, often during moments of crisis.
Yes. Churchill was campaigning in 1950, in the election campaign of 1950, and he said he wanted to have a parley at the summit with Stalin to try and thaw out the Cold War. Now, I think that's a very striking phrase. It's a rather antique word, parley, echoes of Shakespeare here, of uneasy encounters between adversaries, between battles, as it were. But summits is also interesting because in the early 1950s, there's a lot of fascination in the world media about new attempts to conquer the world's highest mountain, Mount Everest. Today, summit, that term has become fairly routine in our political vocabulary, but I think it's still a useful metaphor if we help to bring it to life a little bit, because it conveys something of the challenges and the rewards of meetings at the very top. Climbing to the summit requires a real act of will. That's true for climbers, it's true for politicians. And in the case of the politicians, it's going to take you out of the, if you like, the foothills of domestic policy and politics into a completely new atmosphere right at the top. It can open up spectacular new vistas of what might be done, what might be possible. But also at the summit, it can be very dangerous. You could have a minor slip. You could have a fall that proves to be fatal. So a summit can make or break the reputation of a leader just in the same way as it can kill a mountaineer. And in this case, the whole world is looking on. And that is really fascinating to follow that story through.
So in this series, we're going to explore the historical realities behind that Churchillian metaphor, looking at the drama and the behind-the-scenes manoeuvring of summits when leaders have met face-to-face for negotiations at pivotal moments. And this ranges from Neville Chamberlain's attempts to appease Hitler through Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin hammering out the post-war order at Tehran and Yalta, Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan's steps towards détente and easing of tension between the superpowers in the Cold War, and on to the 21st century as well, and the more shoot-from-the-hip summitry perhaps of George W. Bush and Donald Trump. David, you wrote a book about Summitry, Summit's 6 Meetings That Shaped the 20th Century, and we made a TV series together for the BBC looking at 3 of those key summits. What drew you originally to the subject as a historian? Why summits?
Well, summits are climactic events that shape history. It's a dialogue between states conducted at the highest level, and the decisions made at the summit didn't just solve or exacerbate immediate crises. They often shape the whole trajectory of global politics for decades to come. And I think modern summits also give us a uniquely well-documented insight into how leaders operated under pressure. We've got the minutes, we've got the transcripts. We can see leaders who've made it to the very top of domestic politics and who now, it's almost like they crave a new challenge. They just need a new challenge at the international level now, not the national level. It's almost like, you're moving on from the Premiership to the Champions League. What about you? I mean, what attracts you as a filmmaker to summits?
Well, summits, it always seems to me, are where so many fascinating elements of history come together. There's inherent jeopardy, and television really thrives, even television documentary thrives on jeopardy. And summits bring you a battle of wills, something rather like a game of poker or chess. Also, you're thinking about a visual medium. Summits have provided some of the defining images of modern history, really. You think immediately of Chamberlain holding aloft that treasured piece of paper signed by Hitler, or Nixon standing at the Great Wall of China, Donald Trump's handshake even with Kim Jong-un in Singapore. It's such a vivid image. So summits are really visual. They're also, it seems to me, a strange mix of pomp and protocol on the one hand, but also extremely intimate. When leaders meet for the first time, it's rather like a first date, as you write in your book. There might be chemistry, there might not, and unpredictable things can and do happen.
Yes, and also I think leaders are representing their country. They're trying to advance its foreign policy in this cut and thrust, as it were, of dealing with opponents. But it's striking too, I think, how leaders often see in their opponents someone who's embodying almost the national character of the other country. It's not just their personal character, but the national character of being French or Russian or whatever it is. And I would say that cultural stereotypes play a big part in summitry. That adds another fascinating layer. And I think that most summiteers have an almost epic sense of history as well, and of themselves as makers of history. These meetings at the summit are clearly very, very heady moments. The chance for almost winning historical immortality, but also the danger of losing your footing and toppling into oblivion. So yes, these are defining moments when months of preparation, perhaps even the whole career of the politician and its legacies, hang on a few minutes of engagement, looking your counterpart, as it were, in the eye. And everything is done in the media spotlight, against the relentless ticking of the clock. You've got to get certain things done. You've got to arrive and leave and so on. And the world is watching. That's really gripping.
Yeah. And because of that, it strikes me that summits are when you see leaders most exposed, grappling with immense pressure, with their often rather large egos, and sometimes, as we'll see in the series, hidden frailties like John F. Kennedy's health issues.
Yeah, I think many of them, it's a big ego and a fragile ego. And those two things go together, and also what makes Summitry particularly dangerous. I mean, the striking ones, I think, particularly if you think of Kennedy and Khrushchev meeting in the early 60s, this is at a time when the world feels close to the brink of nuclear war. So these men, their mentalities, their health are hugely important. And these leaders know it. They know deep down in themselves, I think, their own fragilities and limits, but they are drawn to the summit. It's almost addictive, really, I think, and that's fascinating.
Looking for a true crime podcast that goes beyond the headlines?
When I interviewed her 20 years on, she said that Fred told her there were hundreds of bodies buried in Gloucester.
It's a deeply disturbed love story.
Join Sky News crime correspondent Martin Brunt and journalist Helen Fospero on True Criminals, a weekly deep dive into the cases that shook the world, with insights so shocking they still haunt our imagination today. This is True Criminals.
When Gareth was 14, he was in a relationship with an attractive young teacher at his school, and he thought he was the luckiest boy in the world. But when she walked out of his life, everything started to unravel. 35 years later, everyone's acting like it never happened, and Gareth wants to understand why.
How about the truth? How about we do that first and then we work out where we're going to go from there? How about the truth?
This new 4-part series is about who gets to be a perpetrator and a victim. To listen, just search for Lucky Boy wherever you get your podcasts.
So in our series, we'll be focusing on summits of the modern era. But as you write in your book, the roots of Summitry reach back centuries to times when monarchs and emperors gathered in their kind of lavish tents and grand palaces to carve up empires. Summitry was less common before the 20th century because of the slower pace of international travel. But there are some early summits that throw up really fascinating parallels and themes that will recur in the modern summits we discuss. So taking the field of the cloth of gold, for instance, in the early Tudor period, that shows us the power of spectacle in a summit, but also how hollow that spectacle can be.
Yeah. So this is June 1520, and you've got two of Europe's most flamboyant, larger-than-life monarchs, Henry VIII of England and Francis I of France. They meet near Calais. It's interesting, actually, if you're in a car, you can see a marker for where the meeting took place soon after you come out of the Channel Tunnel and you're driving onto the autoroute. The aim of this meeting, the Field of the Cloth of Gold, was to extend peace, to explore political alliances against particularly their mutual rival, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. But if you look at it now, it seems like more of an excuse for showing off. Henry and Francis both wanted to display their wealth and their prestige in a high-profile power play. And the summit gets its name from the really amazing opulence of the temporary palaces and tents and costumes, many of them literally woven with gold thread. This was where they met for 2 weeks. It wasn't just a one-day outing, as it were. There was jousting, banquets, fountains flowed with wine, and it was just unbelievable. Henry's entourage is supposed to be something like 5,000 people. The French crown needed 10 years to pay off the share of the costs. This was just grotesque.
And after all that, there wasn't much payback for all the extravagance.
No. Within 2 years, I think England and France are at war again. You know, what you have to say is the summit reveals the huge but brittle egos of these two monarchs. And Henry's the one who's particularly impulsive. Some of the events are carefully staged, but at one point, Henry challenges Francis to a wrestling match, and he loses. So this is really a humbling personal moment, and you can imagine this didn't do much to improve the chances of amity and peace, because Henry did not like to be humiliated. So I think this ego issue, which is so evident just under the surface of these kinds of top-level meetings, is part of why, if you like, professional diplomats have always been skeptical about their wisdom. You can go right back to the 15th century. The French diplomat Philippe de Comines, writing in the 1490s, he said very firmly, if great princes have a desire to continue friends, in my judgment, they ought never to meet. It would be better that they accommodated their differences by the mediation of wise and faithful ministers.
And that's what we were already seeing happening at the time in Renaissance Italy, presumably.
Yeah.
Among the tightly knit but ever feuding city-states like Florence, Venice, Milan and Rome, with their growing use of ambassadors.
Yes, as it made sense to have permanent ambassadors based in each city. And these are people then who can keep their ear to the ground. They can gather intelligence and information. They can build up strategic networks and hopefully quickly nip trouble in the bud before it really becomes dangerous for their own states. And the reports and the correspondence of these ambassadors back to their home countries and their home bases became a convenient substitute for personal summitry.
But I suppose the ambassadors couldn't solve everything, and it took a kind of group summit on a massive scale to achieve something like the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, which brought an end to the 30 Years' War, which was a bitter religious conflict between Catholics and Protestants after the Reformation in Europe. David, what makes that particular summit such a landmark?
Well, for a start, it's not a single meeting, unlike the Field of the Cloth of Gold. It's a series of negotiations in different locations because Protestants and Catholics wanted to keep each other at arm's length. You have to remember just how bitter those wars of religion were in the 17th century. And you've also now got, for the first time, a whole variety of states coming together to negotiate a comprehensive peace which would deal with issues of territory, but also deal with this explosive problem of religion. So you've got the Holy Roman Emperor, you've got France, you've got Sweden, Spain, Dutch Republic. They'd all got seats at the table, smaller states as well. And the whole Peace of Westphalia and the conference associated with it's famous for introducing the concept of state sovereignty, the sovereignty of states, the idea that each nation has an authority over its own territory and over affairs like religion that's going to be free from outside interference. That's really the foundation of our modern system of international relations. And that's why I think often people hark back to Westphalia, the Westphalia system, as a major moment in international relations.
Yeah. And this was a summit that was driven not so much by personalities or public spectacle, but by unseen mechanism.
Yes. I mean, most of the negotiations, the significant negotiations, are conducted by diplomats, advisors and aides working behind the scenes to map out strategies to kind of test out what ideas might work, develop possible compromises through these back channel negotiations, hopefully without them getting out into the larger public. And it's in those back channels that the crucial breakthroughs are made.
But eventually, as we reach the Victorian age, face-to-face meetings between rulers come back into fashion. And in your book, you call the Congress of Berlin in 1878 the precursor of modern summitry. Why?
Well, I think the simple answer is technology, because this is a summit made possible by the new transport technology of the time, which is railways. It took the British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli just 4 days to travel to Berlin. He wanted to be there at this Congress in person to offset the power of the German Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, a wily operator, as the European powers now were circling around the remains of the increasingly weak Ottoman Empire. Disraeli's aim was to revive Turkey's power in the Balkans to act as a kind of counterbalance to Russian expansion.
Oh, this is really bringing back memories of school history lessons. And I remember from those that the Congress was seen as a great personal triumph for Disraeli.
Yeah.
That he played the conference cleverly and with brinkmanship, anti-Russian speeches, getting the result he wanted, which was a big Bulgaria split up. Remember the phrase big Bulgaria, and a bonus as well of Britain obtaining the island of Cyprus. But you argue that the story is not quite as simple as some of the biographers of Disraeli portray it.
Yes, well, I mean, I'm not saying anything very unfamiliar, I think, to historians of the period. It's undoubtedly the case Disraeli returns home to take the credit. He returns home to a hero's welcome, and he declares that he's brought back from Berlin peace with honour. Peace with honour, what proves to be a fateful phrase in the history of Summitry. But in fact, most of the detailed negotiations that led to the Treaty of Berlin were done by his foreign secretary, Lord Salisbury. And frankly, the Congress wouldn't have gone ahead if there hadn't been pretty much confidence on all sides that a deal had been worked out. Once again, those back-channel negotiations that really laid the groundwork. But Disraeli is more than just being the puppet of the diplomats. There's no doubt that his tough talking did at times help to bring the Russians into line. So I'd say that what Berlin reveals is actually the power of teamwork in summits. And that's another of the themes we're going to explore in this series. An example in my mind is Richard Nixon's breakthrough visits to Beijing and Moscow in 1972. So these are the capitals of the communist world. These are the centers of the, if you like, almost religious creeds of Marxism, Leninism. And Nixon is going there in person now to make these breakthroughs, to talk to the leaders, to start unlocking a process of détente, relaxation of tension. That's what the word détente means. But all those visits that he conducted are set up by the prior work of his key aide, Henry Kissinger. So it's a double act. Similarly, at the end of the Cold War, you've got the diplomacy of Ronald Reagan and George Bush Sr. in helping to end the Cold War, dealing with particularly Mikhail Gorbachev. But they're very ably supported, those presidents, by their secretaries of state, George Shultz for Reagan and Jim Baker for Bush. Again, a double act.
So from lavish feasts to frantic negotiations in the 20th century, Summitry obviously evolved over the centuries. But David, you argue that the practice of modern Summitry, leaders meeting face-to-face to thrash out issues directly with each other, was pioneered by the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. The events around the Munich conference in 1938 are going to be the subject of our next two episodes. Why does Munich stand out for you in the history of Summitry?
Well, I argue that Chamberlain invented modern Summitry. What was going on here was that he feared a new European war in the age of the bomber, a completely new technology with huge dangers, weapons of mass destruction, if you like. But he also realizes that this new technology, the aeroplane, could be an instrument of diplomacy as well as a weapon of war. And his brilliant idea, he certainly thought of it at the time as a brilliant idea, was that he could fly to Germany for a face-to-face meeting with Hitler, a journey that would take only 4 hours, not 4 days, as was the case for Disraeli going to Berlin in 1878. And he could see this as a spectacular gesture that could knock the Führer off balance, because this was a man, Hitler was calling the shots, doing all sorts of things that surprised people and knocked them off balance in governments around Europe. Here was a chance to seize the initiative with a spectacular gesture and allow Britain to start calling some of the shots. Well, now, of course, we know that Chamberlain's gamble was seen as a disaster, but the shuttle diplomacy, the toing and froing by plane between the capitals that he pioneered, actually became very quickly a vital facet of international relations. And within a few years, Winston Churchill, as a globe-trotting prime minister, is doing that during the Second World War. So in a nutshell, I say that Summitry was made possible by air travel, made necessary by weapons of mass destruction, and made into household news, if you like, by the mass media of newsreels and television.
It's fascinating to compare Munich to those earlier summits. Unlike the Peace of Westphalia, which unfolded over months, Munich was about a series of short, high-pressure personal meetings. It shows that the tempo of Summitry evolved with modern transport, but also, as you say, the immediacy of public opinion could be expressed and create other layers of reaction.
Yeah. And the immediacy of public opinion only intensifies in the decades to come. So unlike Roosevelt and Churchill and Stalin, who had the chance to negotiate in relative privacy, today's leaders have to navigate instant public scrutiny. The 21st century technological innovation of unfiltered social media, for better or worse, amplifies every word, every gesture. It helps to turn summits into global spectacles in real time. If you think, for example, of Trump's summit with Kim Jong-un of North Korea in 2018, there's months beforehand of on-off speculation as the sort of tension and the drama of whether they're going to meet or not builds up. They finally meet, there's this handshake. Is this a historic thaw in relations between two absolutely bitter Cold War enemies, who fought each other in 1950? But then the world waits to see if there's a substantive follow-through and puzzles over whether this is really just a sort of cloth of gold piece of theatre.
Yeah, it's really striking how Trump and his unpredictability have only increased since then. It's early 2025. He's conducting a kind of influencer diplomacy already, talking about buying Greenland or annexing Greenland, using memes and posts on Truth Social and X. His election in 2024 for a second term, after being written off 4 years earlier, has really obviously unsettled allies and adversaries alike. You speculated when you wrote your book in 2007 that personal Summitry had reached its peak in the Cold War era of the 70s and 80s. Is that still your view?
No, to be frank. And part of what's fascinating about being a historian, particularly of contemporary affairs, is that your perspective changes with time and with events to some extent. And that's why I think it's great for us now to have another go at this whole question. It's also striking, of course, it's not just the changes of technology and things like that, but if you go back to the 2000s, the noughties, the US still seemed to be the emphatic, sort of almost unequivocal focus of world politics. And the NATO alliance, remember, was welcoming in lots of countries that had previously been part of the Soviet bloc. But now, in 2025, Western predominance around the world is being seriously disputed. It's like that sort of convergence we saw around 2007 is now being replaced by confrontation. And what's more, the confrontation revolves around the huge egos of strong and largely unfettered leaders, people like Putin, Trump, and Xi Jinping. So the theatre and the power plays of Summitry are back with a vengeance in a way that I hadn't envisaged in the 2000s.
Yes, and I'm struck also by how the media scene has been revolutionised as well. When we made our BBC series, Twitter, I think, had just been invented in 2006. Our series came out in 2007. Steve Jobs launched the first iPhone in 2007 when we broadcast. And there's been so much technological change since then, and particularly thinking now about AI as a new impetus. ChatGPT pioneered in 2022, launching an AI revolution, really, in the very same year that Putin invaded Ukraine.
Yes. So there are plenty of reasons to talk anew about Summitry.
So next time we're diving deep into that dramatic brinkmanship of September 1938. Was Chamberlain's policy of appeasement a catastrophic failure or a tragic necessity? We'll explore the tense behind-the-scenes conversations between Chamberlain and Hitler and ask, who actually blinked first? You've been listening to David Reynolds and Russell Barnes in Creating History. Please rate, review and recommend our show on your favourite podcast app. It really helps us get the word out and extend our reach. You can follow us at @creating_hist on X or Instagram and send us your comments and questions there or by email to info@clearstory.co.uk. Also, do check out our first series, Creating Churchill, available wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like to buy us or the team a coffee at ko-fi.com, we'd be very grateful. Details of how to donate are in the podcast description. Creating History is produced and edited by Russell Barnes, with music by Rich Farnsworth, digital marketing by Lee Mann, and sound engineering by Andrew Chappell. Creating History is a Clear Story production.